Let's see how well you did at capturing some common flag words. I don't expect that my list will be identical to yours because of perhaps the fact that where you work there are certain expressions that come up more regularly or that you notice are particularly inflammatory to the consumers where you are. And hopefully you're talking to your colleagues and classmates about this as you go through it to identify specific words in your location. Many of these will be jargon and abbreviations which are again specific to where you work. So, for example, telling somebody that I'm going to refer their case to an SBT in the school system sounds like a bad thing, when in actuality it's not a bad thing at all. It's called the school-based team, and that would still be pretty intimidating for most people. But really a better way of putting it is, I'm going to take up what you need with some of my colleagues. That would be a very easy way to put it into plain language. A colleague of mine today sent me a publication showing that they've done some research, and some of the best received publications out there are written at a grade 4 level, even for people who are adult. So when we talk about plain language, putting things into the simplest language, the most direct language, can often be very helpful. I asked you to consider whether you or I were flag words. If you're like me, then you've noticed that I statements get you much further than you statements. Saying to somebody, I need you to take your shoes off, or I need you to do this for me, or I would like it if you would do this, gets me much further than saying, you need to take off your shoes, or using, even worse, the implied use of you in what we call the imperative. So now this sounds like take off your shoes, because now people, of course, are feeling very commanded and very disempowered. So whenever possible, try to use an I statement as a way of getting a person to relate. They will be more likely to use I statements with you as well, instead of using you or accusatory statements. When describing how you feel, describe how you feel, not how other people are behaving. That's a far more effective approach. No is a very singular flag word. Really stands out for many of the people we've been working with over the years. They often become very sensitized to it because, again, it signals almost immediately that the person's power is not being granted or respected. So we often are looking for an alternative to no. I'm not suggesting that the answer should change to a yes per se, but that we should be clear about the contingency. When we think about it, there are really very few times in life when the answer is actually purely a no. For example, if somebody says to me, would you do me a favor? The answer might be, I can do it for you, but it would have to wait to a specific time. Or I can do that for you if you can take on another one of my responsibilities for me. And that's very common. We can either usually refer to a specific time when a no would become a yes, and we want to be very concrete with people when we do that. If we use the word later, it is as well often a flag word for people. So rather than say, no, I can't do that for you right now, or I'll have to do that later, instead I might say, I can do that as soon as I help Susan, or I can do that at 8 o'clock, or I can do that as soon as supper is finished, so that people are really clear. The other thing we can do is build it on a positive contingency. A positive contingency means that I'm getting the person to do something, and then afterwards the response will be in the affirmative. For example, the person might say, is there supper coming? And you might say something to them to the effect of, as soon as your shoes are off, I'll take you down to the cafeteria. Or as soon as you finish filling in that form, I'll get somebody to come and take your order for you. So that people are always aware that they have some power. And it also has an effective motivational approach as well. Can't, won't, or any such language that implies that you could do something if you wished to do it will absolutely get people inflamed. So again, think about that positive contingency as a way of expressing it, because these are really just variations on the answer no. Should, shouldn't, must, and have to are all judgment implying remarks. They tell a person that you're applying a value judgment to how they should behave. Rules, policy, not allowed. A word I don't have typed down here but should is the word don't. Probably right up there with no in terms of its inflammatory value. And again, it implies that you mean you in that imperative. So it kind of hits a number of things all at once. Many of the people we'll work with are, again, very sensitized being told that they can't do something because it's against the rules or not allowed within the policy. And I got to tell you, I learned long ago that this is not an effective way to get people to listen. Telling them something that you can't do it or it's against the policy does nothing to stop them from pushing. Instead, they change change their bent and try to get you simply to violate the policy by saying things like, well, how would anybody know? Or that policy is stupid and you know it's stupid. So instead, it's better to go right directly to the rationale in simple terms for why that policy might exist. Don't even say the word policy. Instead, just communicate what the reason is for the approach in the first place. These words are particularly bad from my perspective: appropriate, polite, rude, wrong, and one I just used, bad. These words really imply judgment for people, and surprisingly, people think the word appropriate is a better alternative to polite. But what's happened is, for many of the people we work with, they have learned a significant distaste for it. It is both a judgmental word and a very abstract word. It doesn't tell people what they should do, just that you don't approve of their behavior. The word but is a very curious word. A colleague of mine says that when you listen to a sentence of somebody using the word but, everything before the word but should be ignored, and everything after is what's really important to the speaker. And many of our clients know exactly that. They listen for but, and they know that really what you're doing is kind of buttering them up to get them to listen to your contingency. Never and always, or other sweeping generalizations, again, imply judgment for people and are not manageable amounts of feedback. Asking somebody to fix something they did a moment ago or have done once is manageable, but asking people to change the way they always are, or to do something they've never done, even if it seems accurate to you, is an overwhelming way to get somebody to comply, and it backfires. Please is another one. You might be surprised to see please on this list, but please can be a flag word under a certain circumstance. Most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's politeness. But if you use the word please when you really are not intending to imply choice, then it can be a difficult thing, because the person will often respond to that to test this apparent choice. So please keep your voice down. Really, people will often, how many times have you had somebody respond to you by saying, what are you going to do about it if I don't? So it's important not to make it sound like a choice. It's much more important for it to be a simple, clear-cut direction or a positive contingency, such as, I'll need you to take your voice down if you want to stay here. Or if you want to stay in this area, I'll need you to make sure that we don't disturb the people next door. So there are quite a few of the words that we need to watch out for. There are others. We'll talk about some of them later on. One of them that's not on this sheet, but probably should be the most prominent one of all, is the word calm down, or its friend relax. Think about this. In the history of humankind, has it ever actually calmed a person down to go up to them and tell them, calm down or relax? I think you'd agree with me that in general, it's actually always had the opposite effect. It's inflamed people almost every single time. In the second exercise, think about whether or not you avoided flag words in your response. Did any of the words that we just identified, or any that you came up with, show up in that response? Did you manage to keep it brief and to the point so that it wasn't overwhelming and therefore manageable for the person to hear exactly how well you captured their thoughts? Did you put things in your own words? Did you avoid judgmental sounding words, advice giving, or automatically defending or explaining yourself or defending others? Did you capture the content and the feeling of what the person said? In other words, did you use a feeling word? So if we're going to use feeling words, we better have a good idea of what they are and how to discriminate between a feeling word and a non-feeling word. Feeling words are words that truly express how our emotions are being experienced in the moment. And people often mix up feeling words with thought words. Now, I'm not asking you to correct a person when they aren't using feeling words. I'm asking you to be better at using feeling words and not conveying thoughts as feelings. And here's why this matters. In order for people to be effective at managing stress, one of the most important ingredients is emotional intelligence, being strongly aware of and having, as much as possible, an ability to master or control, or at least mitigate the negative impacts of our emotions in certain social circumstances. In order to do that, we start by being aware of our emotions. And people who aren't aware of their emotions often instead directly draw faulty conclusions about what they're feeling by overlaying thoughts, rationally inaccurate thoughts. And this is some of the stuff that Albert Ellis talked about in rational emotive therapy or rational emotive behavior therapy. The basic idea behind his approach was, if you look at people's stinking thinking, the flawed thinking process that they apply, then often you'll get at the root of why they behave a certain way. And oftentimes when we talk to people, they have been taught that feelings are accurate, nobody can judge your feelings, but thoughts or beliefs are interpretable. And the problem with this is that, and that's probably an accurate statement, I should say, but there are many people who will express something as a feeling when actually it's a thought. Thereby they are absolutely certain that what they're saying is accurate and not able to be interpreted by others and cannot be reframed, when in actuality it's a thought and it can be questioned and it can be reframed, and one can stop and pause to think about whether the emotion that they're having is well connected to the thought. And then the behavior that ensues needs to be well connected to both of those. So one of the tests for a feeling word, and the simplest, is that feeling words stand alone in the sentence, I feel. So for example, if I say, I feel angry, I know it's a feeling. But I cannot say, for example, you'll hear people say, I feel that you are picking on me. Doesn't pass the test. I feel picking on me. So as soon as it doesn't fit into this I feel blank format, it should be a huge indicator to you that likely you're not using a feeling word. I feel like is one that's similar to I feel that, but there is a time when it can be used as a feeling word. I feel like you're being mean to me is just the same as I feel that. When a person is speaking in that sense, we know that they are implying a thought by just calling it a feeling. But I feel like somebody ran over me, or I feel like I haven't had a chance to sit down all day. Those are actually metaphorical ways of expressing feelings, and they're quite effective as ways to express feelings. Our job as the paraphraser then is to summarize it. When a person says, I feel like I haven't had a chance to sit down all day, we might paraphrase it as saying, well, you're overwhelmed, or you're stressed, or you're exhausted. I feel like I've been run over is a way of saying, wow, you feel betrayed, or you feel hurt, or you feel, again, overwhelmed. I feel you are is a statement where we are telling people in some way of judging what we think they're thinking. I feel that, as we said, is a way for us to actually masquerade a thought as a feeling. And most people describe their thoughts verbally and their emotions physically in Western society, and in fact many societies. So being able to respond to the person's physical emotions requires a particular skill. We are going to be able to hear their thoughts from the words they use, even if they describe them as feelings, and often pick up more on their emotions by looking at their nonverbal and paraverbal behavior. So for us to do this, we must learn to listen to two voices at the same time. And this is the thing that a good counselor learns early on. Whenever we're listening to that other person, we're also listening to somebody else. And who we're listening to is somebody I call Homey the Homunculus. So the homunculus is a term that the Greeks created for this guy right here, who they imagined existed inside of each brain and was the one that took in information and told us what to do with it. They visualized, literally, that the brain was actually a little creature or spirit that was taking in information and telling us what to do. Well, the idea of the homunculus literally has been long ago left behind. But from a figurative standpoint, I think the homunculus is an incredibly powerful aspect to being an effective, active listener. And I call him Homey just to make him fun, but it's really important that we get good at listening at to our inner narratives. His inside voice, our voice inside of our head, is telling us sometimes that we shouldn't respond when actually we should. And sometimes it's telling us to say things we probably shouldn't. We really want to train Homey to be focused on interpreting people's nonverbal behavior, their paraverbal behavior, and abstract verbal expressions so that we can get people to clarify and so that we can reflect on what people are telling us even if they aren't using words to do so. So listening to that inner voice is a critical skill in assessing other people, really picking up on your instincts, and that takes practice. There's no two ways about it. Not only should we practice, but we should engage in reflective practice. So go ahead and practice this with your coworkers, your partners. Make a game out of it, actually. And later on, reflect back on what your inner voice was telling you and see whether or not the other person says, yes, you responded at the right time, or no, you didn't. What we're really wanting to achieve is something called concreteness. And concreteness is when we seek verbal clarification of unclear behavior, or sometimes we offer that verbal clarification on our own. For example, have you ever been with a person who was listening to you and walked out of the room for a moment? If you didn't use concreteness, you probably thought they had decided to ignore you or that you had said something to offend them. But if you were using concreteness, they might have said something like, sorry, I just have to go around the corner here and get a Kleenex. I'm listening to you. When that happens, they're telling you how to interpret their otherwise abstract or unclear behavior, and they're propelling the communication moving forward. Another name for this, besides concreteness, is meta-communication. Meta means higher or above. And so we're communicating about our communication. It's an exceptionally important thing that we're able to do. For example, we don't normally want to interrupt somebody, but if, for example, we know that we have an emergent circumstance, we would normally want to interrupt a person by saying something very concrete, such as, I'm so sorry I have to interrupt you. I have to deal with this emergency. It just came up. I will give you my attention immediately afterwards so that people know that you haven't just forgotten about them. That same concreteness is something we want to tune into the other person. An individual, for example, sits there and says to you verbally, I'm fine, but the tone of their voice clearly sounds that they're not, and their arms are crossed against their chest. If you're using a concreteness skill, you might say to that person something like, well, I heard you say you're fine, but I also noticed that you had your arms crossed against your chest. I'm wondering whether or not I'm interpreting something the wrong way here, or can you tell me what that means, or can you help me to understand what's actually going on there? Now we have to know the person and be practiced as well, so both of those things are important components. Understanding what's going to work for that individual communicatively, as well as having some skill set in this area. It's like chess in a lot of ways, because you're always trying to think about your moves sort of ahead of time while still being tuned in to the other person. And it's extremely difficult to do this. Explaining what it's about, again, just like chess rules, is not the same as explaining the strategy and becoming adept at it. There's no two ways but experience and practice to make this happen. So we really want to use all of the things that a person is communicating to us to help us be sharp in terms of using that concreteness. So that's their nonverbal. Remember, that was their body language and facial expressions, as well as things like their posture and their proximity to you, and their paraverbal, for example, their tone of voice, their volume, their cadence, that sort of thing. And for some people, even the pitch of their voice. People sometimes get higher voices as they become stressed. And artifactual attributions or attributes we talked about earlier, things like clothing, objects that people are carrying, even what they're fidgeting with, and so forth. So respond to all of those things when actively listening to a person. Let's do another journal entry. In your journal, again, writing in a quick write for 60 seconds, answer each of the following. So you're getting 60 seconds for each of these things. How many words or phrases can you think of that are synonyms of angry? So we're trying right now to come up with as many different feeling words as we can for the word angry. And I think you'll be surprised at how many options there are. What subtle behavior might you observe that would tell you a person was getting angrier? So now we're looking at nonverbal and paraverbal behaviors. What are the constellation of things that you might see, especially in combination, that would tell you a person was angry, enough for you to feel confident to reflect on it? And what might you actually say to respond to a person in question number 2? When you saw that they were telling you non-verbally that they were angry, how might you sum that up or use concreteness to identify what you're saying? Take a moment to answer those questions on the online blog as always, and we will come back to the next video.